I'm incredibly excited to bring back the Ask Dr. S series. This is a format that we used years ago, and I wanted to bring it back because I've observed that students continue to ask certain pressing questions that are shared by a lot of other people, and I want to have an opportunity to speak openly, not in any sort of rehearsed way, in any sort of scripted way, but just to answer all of your questions based on my experience. Now, some of these Ask Dr. S series videos will cover questions related to one topic. Like in this video, we're going to cover questions related to the med school interview, but other videos in this series are actually going to have a completely different format, or I guess topic structure, where maybe one question is related to essays, another question is related to interviews, something else is related to the school list or fellowships or whatever the case may be. And if you want to have your question answered, I encourage you to, drop a question in the comment section of our blog, in the comment section of our YouTube videos, or, a podcast network that you might use to listen to this. And we'll be sure to address them in one form or another. So the format we'll follow is I've got a list of several questions here with me. I'll read them one by one, and then I'll share my thoughts unfiltered. So the first question reads, I've known I would become a doctor my entire life, as there are several doctors in my family, and the expectation was that I would become one as well. I do want to become a doctor and help people, but I have a hard time answering the why medicine question effectively, as I don't want to say because my family is made up of doctors. How would you suggest I answer this question authentically in a way that will impress interviewers? So this question comes up all the time in one form or another. Sometimes students will answer the why medicine question when they're responding to the query, hey, tell me about yourself. Or other times they'll receive the question, why medicine? And it's one of the most stressful ones because it's a really big question. It's a very heavy, weighty question. And there are certain things that you feel that you probably also think that are somewhat cliched, like I want to become a doctor to help people, and because I like science, or because there are a lot of doctors in my family and I sort of grew up around the profession. I think that in my experience, it's not so much that students don't know what their answer is for why medicine, but rather that they worry that their reason is going to be shared by so many other people that they're just going to be seen as a member of a much wider group with no individuality. And I want to dispel that. So always keep in mind that the reason that the medical schools already called you for an interview is because they're impressed to some degree. So medical school admissions committees don't make massive errors in terms of who they invite to interviews. You've already met the threshold, whether that's, a certain GPA or MCAT score they expect, a certain amount of extracurricular hours or experiences that they expect, or maybe something else entirely. So they just want to have you in person to really understand what makes you tick. What was your journey from the person who grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, to sitting in front of the Perelman Med School Admissions Committee today? What happened between childhood and now? What are some of the formative experiences that you have had that have led you to this point? So you got to keep that in mind. They like you enough to invite you to an interview. The other point I want you to keep in mind is that you've already written a bunch of essays. And you've shared to some degree why medicine. You wrote a personal statement. You've written the work and activities section, why you did certain experiences, what they meant to you, why they were formative to you in some way. So you also don't have to regurgitate everything. They liked your answer enough to invite you, and you should lean into that. You should know your application code, and you have to deliver that. So the way that I think about things is, okay, why medicine? First of all, be honest with yourself when practicing. Why do I want to be a doctor? Well, most students will say, I love science and I want to help people. And while, yes, many people say that, and that could feel cliched, that's kind of what the job is, right? You like science and you want to apply it to help people. That's okay. We just have to figure out a creative way to say that and to weave in some personal experiences that have gotten you to this point, and to use those as a way to, maybe even answer other interview questions during the process. So for instance, if you said something like, hey, I grew up in, well, you probably wouldn't start it with hey, but you could say something like, yeah, I'm incredibly happy to be here. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. I'm actually the middle of 3 siblings. So I have an older brother and a younger sister. Both of my parents were educators, and they instilled in me, a passion for learning from a very young age. And I was, very much caught in the middle where, I had an older sibling to look up to, but then, a younger sibling to help raise and take care of. And look, I'm not saying that we wouldn't, have our tensions, but it was just really, formative to understand where I fit in my family and sort of what, expectations were of me. But, when I was taking school very seriously as a child, I just had a natural inclination towards the life sciences. And, from my parents, I learned just how important it is to give back to the community and to help people and to, help people become the best versions of themselves, the most healthy version of themselves, the most educated version of themselves. And I would say my story was more of a slow burn where, I ended up going to Ohio State for my undergrad. I was thinking, yeah, I think I like medicine, and, joined a research lab. And, I was involved in experiments related to fruit flies and looking at vision. And so that was something that just piqued my curiosity, but I wasn't sure if, the academic side of things was my strongest pull. And, I continued to pursue some of my community service experiences in various clinics, locally. And it was wonderful because that really reinforced that, yes, I love science, but I want to apply it to help people. And, obviously Columbus is a very different town from where I grew up, but there were a lot of similarities depending on what, part of town that you were in. And I realized that, yes, I do love the academic side of medicine, but I really want to think about how can I use this to help the largest amount of people in the place that I come from. And just one thing led to another. And along the way that, that fire only grew. And that's why I'm sitting here in front of you today. I'm just incredibly excited at the opportunity, the potential opportunity of becoming a physician so that I can, pursue my lifelong dream. And I couldn't feel more fortunate to be here. So I just made that answer up. I'm not from Youngstown, Ohio. I just had, an avatar in my head when I was coming up with it. But what happened there? So the goal wasn't to necessarily tell you have to answer a question that way, but to give you an example of how to provide some personal context where, an admissions committee can understand your motivations and how they're personal to you. And then notice how we talked about community work, how you've pursued research, being the children of educator or child of educators, being part of a family, being part of a certain community. And those are threads that you can pull on later in your interviews. So with the why medicine question, I wouldn't just think about it as like, why do you want to be a doctor? But also weave in the personal tell me about yourself elements, and then get to the point about why you're sitting here today and why you want to pursue medicine. So our second question reads, I have been invited to interview for several schools this cycle, and I am both excited and anxious. A few schools use the MMI format, which I am less familiar with. What are the 3 most important things to do to prepare for this kind of interview? So first of all, what is MMI? MMI is multiple mini interview. It's very different from a traditional interview. So in a traditional interview, what ends up happening is you maybe have a half-hour interview with questions like, tell me about yourself, or why medicine, or tell me about a situation that was hard for you. An MMI is very different, where you're going to have different stations that you go to, and you're going to be given a prompt or a situation. You'll have about 2 minutes to prepare, and let's call it around 8 minutes to respond to a question. So there are different kinds of scenarios. So you've got, character development scenarios. These can mimic a traditional interview, like tell me about yourself. You're going to have ethical scenarios where you're given a tough situation. Maybe there's even an actor that you have to interact with. And then some of them are teamwork scenarios. So in a teamwork scenario, you're going to be given a prompt, like a drawing that you have to work on with a partner, where you're the person who draws and they're the person who instructs you on what to draw. You don't know what they're wanting you to draw, and they have to give you instructions, or vice versa. And so you have to prepare for them differently. My advice here is to always practice under real world scenarios. So when you're practicing for MMI, do it in the same way as a traditional interview where you actually want to, practice certain answers. The thing with MMI is it's very hard to predict the questions that you will get. Whereas with traditional interviews, we tend to have more of a sense. Okay, so set a timer for 2 minutes, have the prompts. There are plenty of them. For instance, we have our interview sample response library that we worked on with our partners at Health Admissions IQ. You're going to get all of the most common questions and answers related to traditional interviews as well as with MMI. And what you can do is go through those lists of sample questions, see the sample responses, and then practice on your own how you might approach those types of situations. So character development, like I mentioned, is more classic in that traditional interview style. Tell me about a time where you really struggled and you turned to a loved one for help. That may be that type of question. And so you just want to answer it, openly and honestly with a growth mindset, just as you would with a traditional interview. With a character, with an ethical scenario, like I said, you may be in a situation where, I don't know, they make up a hypothetical, like you're the store manager and somebody is asking for a discount because their child needs clothes, but that item is not on discount, but the person can afford it. Think of that the same way you would on the Casper exam, for instance. And then with the teamwork, that's the one that's, I think, going to be most tricky for most people. But you should work with a partner, and we've got those types of questions as well. So going back to that drawing example, there's a situation when I give talks at certain schools, at certain universities where I'm invited. I always like to actually role play this one where, I'll put one student on each side of a table. I'll project a really complex figure to draw, and the person who's the instructor will look at that and then describe to their partner what they're seeing and what they're supposed to draw. And so they're not actually looking for you to have the most beautiful drawing in that scenario, but they want to see how you interact, right? So a lot of students say, I love teamwork and I love working as part of a team and I'm so receptive to feedback and all that kind of stuff. Well, this is your opportunity to show it. So if you're the instructor, you want to be collaborative, you want to praise, you want to be patient, you want to answer questions. If you're the drawer, you want to reach out for feedback, you want to reach out for help and be really receptive to whatever the other person is telling you. And so they're more looking at your interaction. And that's something that I always come back to. And you may hear me say this multiple times in this recording, which is they're not just looking for the content of your answers or the words that you speak, but how you deliver them, how you interact. This is their opportunity to see you in person. So with an MMI, make sure to practice in the way that you would for traditional interviews, but with a completely different format. Next question reads, I received an invitation to interview at my dream school and I am incredibly nervous. How much do interviews matter if the rest of your application is impressive? What are interviewers looking for most in the interview? Great question. And the core is how much do interviews matter and what are they used for? So going back to something that I brought up earlier in this video, they like you. At least they're intrigued by you. They're interested in you. You met some minimum expectation that they're looking for in a prospective medical student. That's great news. Okay. And I want you to keep that in mind because I want to help you reframe it of like, oh my gosh, I'm incredibly nervous because this is my dream school too. Oh my gosh, my dream school likes something about me. What can I do to seal the deal? So why would they interview you? If they wanted just more information from you, why wouldn't they just ask you to write another essay? That's what I would do. That's the much more efficient way if I was just looking for information. I wouldn't go through the whole logistical process of inviting you and setting up the webcams and all this kind of stuff. The other thing is they want to know, are you sociable? In other words, there's always a difference in being in the room with a person versus reading something about them. So for instance, imagine you were on a dating app and there's a whole profile that you write. Fine. And then you meet the person and they meet you. There are some things that are going to be consistent with the way you describe yourself, but there is still that feeling. You still want to understand the chemistry. So that's the sociability. They want to see you in person. And then the third is kind of related to that, which is, are there any interpersonal red flags? So if I'm sitting in front of my computer and I get assistance with essay editorial and stuff like that, I can craft a version of me on paper. That sounds amazing. But in person, I'm different. And sometimes people can be curt. Sometimes they can be brash. Sometimes they can be difficult to connect with. And so they just want to make sure, are you the type of person who can interact with peers, with faculty, with patients in the community, and this is their opportunity to have that. So again, if you got the interview, see it more as a validation of the work that you've already done rather than, oh my gosh, I might trip up. So are interviews important? They're incredibly important. How important are they? Kind of depends on the quality of your application to date. Let me tell you what I mean. So a diagram that, I've written or prepared for our website that I'll share with you now, I'll use my hands. Let's say that this is the finish line, and if you reach this point, you get into medical school. Fine. If somebody has amazing grades, maybe they come this far. And if they have amazing extracurriculars, maybe they come this far. So the gap they need to close is not very wide. Versus if someone's grades are less good and their extracurriculars aren't stellar, but they're solid, that other person has more of a gap to make up. So how important are interviews? They're incredibly important, but they may vary slightly in importance depending on the other aspects of your application. Our first question, I've been invited to interview at a few different schools. I have been preparing a lot, doing mock interviews with advisors and brainstorming answers to common questions asked in med school interviews. However, I'm terrified that I'll get asked a question I haven't prepared for. How do I prepare for this kind of situation? Also incredibly common. We can all imagine a situation where we walk into an interview, we're prepped, we're polished, we're ready, and then they throw a curveball. And that's really scary. So years ago, I used to get this question a lot around the Affordable Care Act, because Obamacare, aka Affordable Care Act, was, a big thing. And, over time, maybe that's top of mind less for people these days, but that's something that came up a lot. Or there's a similar question, students ask, what if they asked me for my thoughts on universal health care or this type of, controversial procedure? What if I share a political view that my interviewer doesn't share and all that kind of stuff? So with an interview, they're not necessarily looking for you to take a certain position for a certain level of correctness. They want to know how you think. Again, going back to my previous response, they also want to see how you react in person. Some questions may be intentionally difficult to see how you respond, but they want to think about your thought process. So remember when you were a student in elementary school and you got a math problem, you might have known the answer, but you still had to show your work. I want you to think about it in the same way here. So let's say that there's a certain question that you're trying to answer and it's a curveball. You could take a minute. You could say, yeah, it's obviously a really weighty issue. That can be really difficult. But here's a way that you can answer it if you're really not sure. And this is not necessarily my opinion. It doesn't matter. I just want to help you think through how you might approach a question where you're not an expert. So you might say something like, wow, universal healthcare is obviously one of the most pressing healthcare matters in our country. And I'm not going to pretend to be any sort of expert here, yet I understand that there are a ton of stakeholders, and what one person wants or one set of stakeholders wants is not necessarily what's shared by everybody else. And my understanding is obviously there are the patients who are at the end of the day the most important. There are the physicians, there are hospital systems, there are insurance providers, and so many other, stakeholders involved in this process. There are policymakers and things of that nature. Look, I'm really excited in medical school to not just understand, biochemistry and how to deliver care to a patient who's experiencing a certain condition, but how all of these different systems interplay with one another. From my perspective, I will support whatever system that allows patients to get the best care, the fastest, with the least red tape, and that doesn't financially harm them. One of the things that, growing up in a small town that I observed and working in, rural healthcare centers is just how difficult it is for people to get care. And I think that that's a travesty. And I've seen situations where people needed very expensive care and couldn't get it. And one of two things happened. Either they had to take on a backbreaking loan that put their, financially, their family in even more difficult financial situation, or they had to, have a health outcome that was even worse than they initially thought. And so, as a physician, I want to make sure that I'm an advocate for my patients. I've been interested in policy and shaping what I can to make sure that, whatever system is in place allows people to get care the fastest. Now, if the best way to do that is through a universal system, I will support that, and I will make sure to adapt it in a way that my community will most benefit. So you see there, you didn't demonstrate any sort of expertise in this, but your thought process of you understand who the different stakeholders are. You had a goal, which is making sure that your patients got the best care. And you took that position and you talked about being an active advocate for people. That's the kind of thing that works. So always apply that logic in situations where you don't have a perfect answer, a rehearsed answer, and you'll be just fine. All right, our fifth and final question reads, I have several med school interviews coming up. No matter how much I prepare, the one question that continues to trip me up is, tell me about yourself. What is the best way to frame an answer for this question? This is probably the granddaddy of them all. Tell me about yourself, because it's the most open-ended. So we talked about why medicine earlier in this video. And when it comes to tell me about yourself, that's another really big one, because at least the why medicine question has the medicine anchor, where this one is completely different. It's like, do you jump into the medicine part or do you treat it differently? And this is what we can unpack. But because we talked about the why medicine, I would always encourage you to go back and, hear out my answer to that, because there is going to be some overlap here. It's not always that they'll ask you both the tell me about yourself and the why medicine question. But what I find that students will take on this tack of just kind of getting into the medicine part right away. Tell me about yourself. Well, I'm a biology major at, Chapman University in Orange County, and I've always wanted to be a doctor. My mom's a doctor, but, I really had to sort of come into it on my own. I've always been passionate about research. So they'll kind of go into this regurgitation of their extracurricular experiences. And I understand that's a fast way to answer the question, but it's not very personal. It falls kind of flat. So the way that I think about this is, imagine that you were at a coffee shop and somebody approached you and said, hi, my name is Darius. I saw that you were reading, this book, tell me a little bit about it, or whatever. You started to strike up a conversation with someone at a cafe. You wouldn't probably go into your resume. So this is the perfect opportunity to humanize your background. So don't just go into all the things that you've done extracurricularly and what your grades were and what your major was and things like that. First of all, they may have that, especially if it's an open file interview. But even if it's a closed file interview, you still want to give that background. So thinking about that why medicine answer from before, I would encourage you to take a similar approach here, where you say, tell me about yourself. You can say, well, my name is, Shirag Shemmassian, and I grew up in Los Angeles. So I'm the child of two immigrant parents, both of whom came to the United States from Lebanon. And for them, it was very important that, we have a better life, my older brother and me, rather than deal with the tumult that they did in having to immigrate during a wartime period. And so I always took my, schooling very seriously. I always, figured that I should do something to help people. And that's what, led me to focus heavily on the academics. But, growing up, I was a total, video game nerd, and I love playing basketball. To this day, I'm a huge basketball fan, go Lakers. And, those are things that I pursued on the side. But my passion was always about, making sure that I can apply my, fullest efforts to helping people. And so when I, went to college, that was something that I actively pursued. So for me, I think for a long time, I've known that I wanted to be a physician. My parents had planted that seed that, hey, it's something that I might like, given what they were seeing with my, love for the life sciences. And so when I went to college, I pursued all those different things, whether it was with research or clinical work or service work. And, even after college, I was able to, pursue some work in MRI research, and eventually, moved on to, applying to medical school, because I figured this was just my calling from a young age. And so you can go on and on about that. But let's unpack it. Your story is going to be different. What I described was, largely true about me. But the point here is that starting with that chronological background, like I did with the why medicine, can be a really safe and actually really interesting way, because your story will be distinct. So when you're worried about, oh my gosh, I'm going to be so cliched and things of that nature, this is the kind of thing that allows you to actually share with them how you're distinct. And like I said earlier in the video, we've partnered with Health Admissions IQ to bring you all of the most common traditional and MMI interview questions with sample responses for each. So I encourage you to check that out. There will be a link in the description below. If you're interested in having a one-on-one interview coaching session, we would love to have that with you as well. We do that with, numerous students every single year to make sure that when you get so close to the finish line, you can seal the deal. And then finally, again, I'm gonna ask that you, click the like button and subscribe. I wanna make sure that these videos continue to reach you and other students who are struggling and looking for demystification around the medical school admissions process. And if you have any other questions, like I said, leave them in the comments, whether on our blog or in our video. But I'm really looking forward to resurrecting this Ask Dr. S series and bringing some great content your way. Take care.